He is 22 years old, and he is about to commit treason. The year is 1863, the port of Yokohama. A lean young man stands at the edge of the dock, the gray harbor water slapping the pilings below his feet. He is wearing an indigo kimono, the silk faded, the kind a man wears when he can't afford to care what he looks like anymore, and over it, a dark wool frock coat with mismatched seams and buttons that don't quite belong. In both hands, pressed flat against his chest like a shield or a prayer, he holds a battered black top hat. Two worlds, one nervous grip. Behind him, the city he knows. Ahead, a Dutch merchant vessel that will take him somewhere the law of his country says he cannot go. Leaving Japan in 1863 is a crime punishable by death. He knows this. He's going anyway. Who is this man? And why does the answer explain how an isolated island nation, feudal, sword-carrying, deliberately frozen in time, became a world power in less time than it takes a child to grow up? His name is Ito Hirobumi. And in 1863, almost nobody on Earth has heard of him. He is a low-ranking samurai's son from a domain called Choshu. He has no money, no title, no formal education in anything Western. What he has is a terrifying clarity about one thing. Japan is going to be destroyed. Not by invasion, not yet, but by its own refusal to see the world as it actually is. 10 years earlier, in July 1853, an American commodore named Matthew Perry had sailed 4 warships, 2 of them steam-powered, black-hulled, belching smoke, into Edo Bay. The Japanese had never seen steam-powered warships. They called them the Black Ships, Kurofune. And Perry's message was not subtle. Open your ports to American trade or face the consequences of what these ships can do. Japan had been sealed for 250 years under the Tokugawa Shogunate. No foreign travel, no foreign trade, except a single Dutch outpost on a tiny island in Nagasaki Harbor. The country had no modern navy, no modern army, no industrial base. Against Perry's ships, the most powerful warriors in Japan, men who had spent their entire lives mastering the sword, had nothing. Ito Hirobumi watched his country's leadership fracture under that pressure. Some said expel every foreigner. Some said bow your head and survive. And then there was this third option, the one nobody expected, pushed by a small, furious group of young men who had actually seen the outside world. Ito was one of them. They said, learn from them or die by them. And that's just the beginning. Because the real question isn't whether Japan could survive the shock. The real question is, how do you rebuild an entire civilization on purpose in a single generation without losing what makes you, you? Here is what this video is actually about. It is not about Perry's ships, though we'll talk about them. It is not about samurai, though we'll talk about them too. It is about something rarer than military victory or economic growth. It's about a society choosing, deliberately and collectively, to become something it had never been before. It is about a country that looked at its own potential extinction, clearly, without flinching, and made a choice. A strategic choice. Not panic, not denial, a choice. By 1905, 42 years after Ito Hirobumi stood on that dock in Yokohama committing treason, Japan's navy would sail into the Tsushima Strait and destroy the Russian imperial fleet in a battle that lasted less than 2 days. A European empire humiliated by a nation the West had dismissed as a curiosity. We are going to track exactly how that happened, the specific decisions, the specific people, the specific gambles that paid off, and the ones that cost something real. And at the end, we're going to sit with a question that should make you slightly uncomfortable, because Japan's playbook, the one they built from nothing in 40 years, is sitting right there in the open. From ashes to insights. The lesson is available to anyone. So why doesn't everyone use it? To understand what Japan chose to become, you have to understand what Japan was, and how deliberately it had been kept that way. The Tokugawa Shogunate had ruled Japan since 1603, and from almost the beginning, the Shogunate had understood something that most governments never articulate out loud. Foreign contact is destabilizing. New ideas are destabilizing. Trade creates dependencies. Missionaries create divided loyalties. So between 1633 and 1639, the shogunate issued a series of edicts, the Sakoku, the closed country, that made Japan arguably the most deliberately isolated large society in human history. No Japanese subject could leave. No foreign ship could enter most ports. The Dutch trading post on the island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor was the single exception. And even there, the Dutch merchants were essentially kept in a controlled enclosure, their movements monitored, their influence measured in teaspoons. For 250 years, it worked. Japan was stable. Internally, it was sophisticated, a complex feudal hierarchy, extraordinary craft traditions, a rich literary and artistic culture. By 1800, roughly 30 million people lived inside Japan's borders, and almost none of them had ever seen a foreigner. Cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, were among the largest urban centers on Earth. But the world outside had not been standing still. While Japan sealed itself, Europe industrialized. Britain built a steam-powered textile economy. Prussia built a professional standing army organized around logistics and artillery. France codified law. The United States expanded across a continent and built a navy to protect its commercial interests. And by the mid-19th century, that industrialized world was running out of room and looking for new markets. When Perry arrived in July 1853, the shock was not just military. It was existential. The shogunate's entire legitimacy rested on the promise of stability, order, and protection. And here, in the harbor of the capital, were 4 foreign ships that no Japanese force could stop, carrying a letter from President Millard Fillmore that was essentially a politely worded ultimatum. Open your ports. Or don't, and see what happens next. The shogunate signed the Convention of Kanagawa in March 1854. 2 ports opened. American ships could resupply, and the seal that had held Japan together for 2.5 centuries cracked. What followed was 15 years of internal civil war, the shogunate versus the domains that wanted change, the reformers versus the isolationists. And inside that chaos, a coalition of southern domains, Choshu and Satsuma chief among them, fought their way to power under the banner of restoring the emperor. On January 3, 1868, the Meiji Restoration began. Emperor Meiji, 15 years old, was formally restored to power. The shogunate was abolished, and Japan's new leadership, young, furious, and terrified of what the world outside could do to them, had to answer a question no country had ever faced so consciously. How do you rebuild everything, fast enough to matter, without becoming someone else entirely? What they built wasn't a reaction. It was a plan, methodical, borrowed from everywhere, and executed with a discipline that frankly stunned the people they were borrowing from. On April 6, 1868, the new Meiji government issued the Charter Oath, 5 short clauses that were, in practice, a demolition permit for the old Japan. Deliberative assemblies, open discussion, abandonment of old customs that no longer served, and the line that mattered most: knowledge shall be sought throughout the world, so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. That last clause was not poetry. It was a procurement order. The Meiji government began systematically identifying which countries were the best in the world at specific things, and then importing that expertise the way you'd import a machine. Britain had the most powerful navy, so Japan sent students to British naval academies and hired British advisors to build a Japanese fleet on British principles. Prussia had the most effective land army, disciplined, professionally trained, organized around a general staff system that had crushed France in just 6 weeks in 1870. So Japan hired German military advisors, adopted the Prussian model of conscription, and built a general staff of its own. France had the most sophisticated legal code, so Japan hired French jurists to help draft a civil code. The United States had a model of mass public education that could reach an entire population, so Japan adopted it. This is the part that most people miss when they talk about the Meiji period. It wasn't imitation, it was curation. Japan didn't adopt a single foreign model wholesale. It tasted everything, kept what worked, and discarded what didn't fit. Now, here is where I want to return to the question we opened with. That young man on the Yokohama dock, pressing a Western top hat against his chest, committing treason to get on a boat. What was he actually doing? What did he see that his government didn't? Ito Hirobumi and 4 other young men from Choshu smuggled themselves onto that ship in 1863 and made it to London. They spent 18 months there. And what Ito understood, standing in the reading rooms, walking through the factories, watching the institutions of a country that had industrialized itself into a global empire, was that the power wasn't in the guns. The power was in the systems. The guns were a product. The Navy was a product. What produced them was something deeper. A legal structure that protected contracts, an educational system that created engineers, a financial system that moved capital where it was needed. Japan didn't need to copy the weapons. Japan needed to build the machine that made the weapons possible. Here is the fact that should stop you. By 1876, just 8 years after the Meiji Restoration, the new government abolished the samurai class entirely. Not slowly, not as a suggestion. They banned the wearing of swords in public. They replaced the stipends that samurai families had received for generations with government bonds, then offered those bonds at a discount, effectively transferring that wealth into industrial investment. 2.5 centuries of warrior aristocracy dismantled in less than a decade. The samurai did not accept this quietly. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, perhaps the most famous samurai in Japanese history, a man who had helped make the Meiji Restoration, led a rebellion of 40,000 disaffected warriors against the new government, the Satsuma Rebellion. And the new conscript army, farmers and merchants and tradesmen trained on the Prussian model, defeated them. The sword lost to the rifle. And Japan's leadership led it. By 1890, Japan had 28,000 kilometers of telegraph lines, a national railway network. The Osaka Spinning Company, founded 1882, was running 24-hour shifts with imported British machinery, producing cotton thread that could compete on world markets. And in 1889, Ito Hirobumi, the boy who had committed treason to get on a boat, presented Japan with a written constitution, modeled partly on Prussia's, but unmistakably Japanese in its structure, its language, its insistence on imperial sovereignty. 2 worlds, 1 document. The same nervous grip, but steadier now. On May 27, 1905, the Russian Imperial Baltic Fleet, 38 warships that had sailed 18,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the waters between Japan and Korea, met the Japanese combined fleet in the Tsushima Strait. 38 Russian ships entered those waters. In less than 48 hours, 34 of them were sunk or captured. The rest were scattered. Russian Admiral Rajestvenski was wounded and captured. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats. The ratio of casualties was so lopsided that European military analysts initially refused to believe the reports. Theodore Roosevelt, who brokered the peace treaty that followed, wrote in private that the outcome had astonished the world. That is an understatement. In 1905, no Asian nation had defeated a European great power in a modern military engagement. It had simply never happened. The entire architecture of colonial logic, the assumption that Western industrial nations were militarily unchallengeable by non-Western peoples, cracked at Tsushima. and Japan had done it in 40 years. Here is where we sit with the uncomfortable part. South Korea in 1960 had a per capita GDP lower than Ghana. By 2023, it was the 13th largest economy on Earth, with a per capita income above $33,000. The transformation took roughly 50 years, and it followed a recognizable pattern. State-directed industrial policy, mass investment in education, strategic technology acquisition, and a fierce insistence on cultural continuity alongside economic change. Singapore in 1965 was a city-state with no natural resources, no hinterland, and a per capita GDP of around $500. By 2023, it had the highest per capita GDP in Asia, over $65,000, built on the deliberate, strategic importation of expertise and institutions, exactly the way Meiji Japan had done it a century earlier. Rwanda, a country that in 1994 experienced one of the worst genocides of the 20th century, has, by 2024, built one of the fastest-growing tech ecosystems in sub-Saharan Africa. GDP growth averaged over 7% per year for the 15 years following 2000. These are not miracles. They are decisions. And here is the part that should unsettle you. Not because it's hopeless, but because it means the absence of transformation is also a decision. Every nation currently watching its industrial base erode, its educational outcomes decline, its institutions lose public trust, they have access to the same playbook Japan used. Study who does each thing best. Import that knowledge aggressively. Preserve what is yours. Move faster than feels comfortable. The Meiji leaders were not geniuses. They were terrified people who chose learning over pride. That choice is available right now, today, to any society willing to make it. Learn from the past to shape the future, or don't, and face what the black ships represent when they arrive in a different form. That young man on the Yokohama dock in 1863, pressing a foreign hat against the Japanese chest, wasn't choosing between two worlds. He was proving something uncomfortable, that the civilizations which survive aren't the ones that stay pure or the ones that surrender. They're the ones that can live inside the tension of two opposing ideas long enough to build something neither idea could have produced alone. Japan transformed in 40 years, but the transformation didn't stop there. The same strategic confidence that rebuilt the country from the ground up eventually turned outward, toward empire, toward war, toward 1945. So the next question isn't how Japan rose, it's what happens when everything that saved a country, the discipline, the nationalism, the military machine, stops being a shield and starts being a weapon. That story is next.